This community update was brought to you by U Radio. The Winnipeg Newcomer Sport Academy conducted a study and recently released a report tackling Islamophobia through sport and physical activity. I spoke with Richard Sylvester, Quality Sport Director at the Winnipeg Newcomer Sport Academy, and Eve Satoriato, the Executive Director of the Canadian Muslim Women's Institute, about their roles in the project.
Lifelong lover of sports, and I appreciate the power and the effectiveness it has as a vehicle for teaching skills to kids. Um, I used to work uh, with older and university athletes in kind of a strength and conditioning kind of role. And now I've transitioned into this child and youth recreation space, and specifically those other skills, the social skills and the mental skills that are so prevalent in life. And sport becomes a really powerful vehicle for those. And it really is kind of the space that I appreciate in my, especially in my role with the Winnipeg Newcomer Sport Academy, where I serve as the quality sport director, and ensure that we do have an intentionally structured program, which does hit on those mental, social skills, in addition to engaging in physical skills, like all the different sports that we do in our multi-sport program.
Hello, my name is Eve Satoriato. I am the Executive Director of the Canadian Muslim Women's Institute, and I participated in this research in two different dimensions. One as a lead researcher for the research component, and then CMW in particularly put together a group of women and girls who participated in one of our case studies.
When we're looking at just the populations in the current kind of political sphere, I paid really close attention to the New York mayoral race. And one of the things that very dishearteningly I noticed was how prevalent and how nonchalant Islamophobia was in a lot of the messaging from Cuomo and some of the other political commentators and news outlets on there. It's one of those things that, Islamophobia is just so prevalent. So when we're looking at this particular project, why did you want to get involved? And, for Richard and you, Eve, what are some of those things that you noticed and were hoping to look for in terms of tackling Islamophobia through the activity of sports and other physical activities?
Well, I think Richard beautifully explained how sports can become a medium to address the diverse forms of hate in our community and then bring communities together as well from diverse backgrounds. So that became a divisive role for, deciding to embark on this endeavor. So personally, I felt that one way that we can address anti-Muslim racism, with particularly in regards to the youth, that could happen by adopting protocols and practices that we see within the sports environment, and then extending opportunities to youth that perhaps might be coming from marginalized backgrounds, or where Islamophobia and racism has informed their experiences with regards to accessing opportunities and learning opportunities, in particular in their community. So having Richard, for instance, as part of the research in itself was instrumental, because he possesses that field knowledge, but also his research skills, really complementing how we created the sessions according to the needs and the demographics involved. So, Richard, I'll pass it on to you.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, our role with WNSA is kind of like a facilitator. So I guess to use the basketball reference, we're like the point guards, whereas the Muslim coaches and the non-Muslim coaches were like the real stars of the show. They're the ones that are working together on the field. It's great to see. And, we just attempted to facilitate some of those connections, because sometimes people that don't always interact together, sometimes there's this period of warming up to each other. Yeah, so yeah, we're just trying to facilitate those connections because sport is a powerful tool, and we were happy that both groups were part of this wonderful experience where you know we have the power of sport to bring people together.
Through those discussions and engagements through this study, what were some of those systematic barriers that you were noticing, whether it came to Muslim participants, their families, as well as other newcomer groups are coming in and looking for those opportunities to get engaged in the community through sports?
It depends on which group, I guess, you're referring to, but a common denominator amongst all of the participants, especially those that were fairly new to Canada or whose parents were not necessarily as immersed within, Canadian society, you could really see that, the parents were very instrumental in bringing together youth and, working on that component of home or instilling that anti-racist lenses were not necessarily part of the community sports life, right? Like you would see how we had parents of the non-Muslim students and athletes sort of being more involved in decision making, more involved in organizing these sessions, more involved in sort of the extracurriculum activities of their youth. But for immigrant, newcomer, even racialized parents, that's not always the case, primarily because of the additional responsibilities that follow when we're discussing migration, especially if it's forced migration due to circumstances such as war or economic insecurity. But also language barriers were a factor for that. And a lot of times, blunt ignorance because the moms from the Muslim majority, from the Muslim youth might, have the hijab or might be dressed in more cultural regalia. They were sitting on their own versus the Canadian, presumably Canadian, stereotypically Canadian parents would, be all together during practices. So, but with that being said, the parents did extend invitations to Muslim parents, and you kind of solve that piece as well, right? Of how important it is for the parents to be in tune and on board with this sort of endeavors, and also cultivate space where they can promote some of that knowledge piece to other parents, because as an immigrant coming to this country, you're trying to figure out everything, and the system is operating differently. You are working yourself to death because that's what we do in Canada and in North America. So you might not necessarily be aware of opportunities, resources. Also, accessing resources, accessing material supplies needed for sports has become a big barrier for you that are coming from marginalized backgrounds, racialized backgrounds, because it's so expensive and there are different priorities. When the youth is coming from a war conflict zone, they have, escaped war, the parental priorities are not necessarily recreational activities, but sending money back home, sending money to the relatives that couldn't make it to safety. So, priorities are shifted, priorities are different for parents who are navigating, complex trauma and trying to survive in North America as well.
What are some things that you noticed, Richard?
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple points. There, it's possible that there's a heavier load on some of the newcomer
Yeah.
participants. Whether it's okay, I don't have transportation. My family has one car or no cars, so it's a struggle to get there. Or they might have large families. They might have to take care of their siblings instead of coming to sports. They might have some food security issues. There's cost barriers, and so it brings. You've also mentioned, yeah, language barriers, and all of that just brings, a little bit more of a load, when kids are coming to practice or any kind of session. It's not just show up and play. There's a few prerequisites in order to just be present. And then overcoming any of these things, it's not just a matter of calling the parents and saying, hey, like we need, Johnny needs more more uniforms, needs money for this. It's a bit of navigating a few obstacles.
What are some of those other, ways we can break those barriers? Looking through the report, there are several recommendations on there to help foster that community cohesion and community growth. What are some of those things that we can help newcomer communities? I mean, Richard, you mentioned, funding, uniforms, those sorts of things can go a long way. What are some other areas or aspects that us as communities or organizations can come together to remove those barriers so even more people can come together to celebrate sport and build, potential friendships that could last a lifetime?
Yeah, I think it starts with being curious. I think sometimes I'll speak about the sports system. It could come with a bit of rigidity, and okay, this is the way we do it. This is what works for us, but then it might not work for those populations that we're working with. I'll give an example: registration forms, online registration forms, QR codes generally aren't the preferred method of registration forms for a lot of our populations. Some of it's hand registration forms, written registration forms, and to organize, let's say, 40 registration forms or waiver forms for kids of families that have all these other priorities is very difficult. So I think being curious and seeing what works for families, I think is a pretty key step. Um, and refraining from being rigid. I think that's a good starting point for me.
Yeah. What do you think, Eve?
Being more intentional about your individual interactions with the community at large. I firmly believe each one of us has skills, resources that we can extend to each other and overcome these barriers that limit our youth and children from engaging with each other and playing together, learning together. Something that I firmly believe that Canadian parents possess so much knowledge about resources and how to navigate the system that could really extend all of that information to immigrant communities and racialized communities that have a hard time accessing opportunities due to systemic barriers. And there's these ways that, doing it on your own, you don't have, you don't need a campaign across the city or across the country to get you to be a good neighbor and a good, especially when we're talking about instances where out of this opportunity, we came to see some really dedicated coaches, that grew up in Winnipeg and they've spent their lives here. And not only they cultivated time to come together and educated our youth and sharing this sports skill, but also try to find accessible resources like sports gear, equipment that might be needed, and then extend that to the Muslim youth that perhaps might not necessarily have the capacity to access these resources. So I really believe is that, if you have a parent in your community who you see they're more distant, or perhaps they might need, that orientation piece on how to navigate resources in Winnipeg or in Canada in general, I think it's, very important to extend that. You don't need to wait for something organized to get you motivated. And our youth needs it. We see that the white supremacy is on the rise. In our schools, we see how our youth is influenced by figures like Andrew Tate and figures that are pushing on that toxic, misogynistic interpretations of masculinity, very unhealthy. So our youth definitely needs intentional opportunities to come together, and there's no other way to curate those by by coming together as parents and as caretakers. That's what this initiative taught me.
When Richard was talking, I think one thing that stood out to me was, the be curious component of it. When you're looking at kids, they're curious. They don't have hatred or these biases initially. These are things that are stilled in them by their environment. So, the more
Yeah.
curious they are, the more opportunities they have to connect with people of diverse backgrounds, creeds, and beliefs. It creates a stronger community, a more vibrant community. And, some of those other things that I was seeing look in the report, having greater communication, those opportunities, creating that safe space, being aware, people have different religious practices. Some have to go do prayers or things like that. Being aware about that curiosity to just ask and engage, find out
Yeah.
more, being connected with the parents so those parents can help inform you. I also on here the hijab and sporty attire, having those available for young Muslim girls who follow those practices so that they can join the sports team and it's not just something that they're like, oh, now we got to get extra. It's like having it already there
Yeah.
so people feel like they're included and not an afterthought.
Parents too. Because for a lot of parents, that is also the missing piece, right? Seeing how their values can be appreciated and, fostered within that sports environment, and offering Muslim youth the ability to alter school uniform in order to meet their own modesty expectations or understanding. That makes a difference because the parents feel comfortable feeling. A lot of parents, feel like, oh, perhaps within sports there's no opportunities for gender specific playing, like women's only groups, but that's not necessarily the case. We can cultivate these opportunities to make sure that our youth is, engaged in sports and physical activity.
Okay. And then kind of just looking at all of these as we're coming together as a group to tackle, rising white supremacy, Islamophobia, and other discriminations that continue to permeate and infest our communities. How do we keep everyone accountable? Like, particularly when it comes to organizations or sports institutes, how do we ensure accountability so that equity, inclusion, and anti racism are core to these institutions and organizations?
Okay, so how do we keep folks accountable, especially organizations? I think one way to do that would be by trying to dismantle some of that information we cultivated, right? So there is a report that has been produced, and we're not the first group that came together and produced that kind of reporting. We know that anti-Muslim racism is a systemic violence across the country. It's an experience for many folks in our community across Manitoba and beyond Manitoba. So I think as a community, we need to make space to share this knowledge and then implement it, find ways that we can take theory and apply it. And the easiest way to do that is by recognizing the diversity in our community. And then again, cultivating these intentional spaces.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that cultivation, it's intentional. We're being curious and cultivating an opportunity with people to connect. I think it's hard to just say, hey, do this DEI thing. I think we gotta get together, connect, do fun things, be together, and then we grow it over time.
Now that this report has come out, we're learning from it. We're seeing it. Those involved, I'm looking at some of the comments and things that have been posted alongside this of the people who have learned things from this, who engaged, got excited. What are kind of those next steps? Where do we go from here? We've identified these things. We have these recommendations. What are those next steps?
Take it up a level. Would be one way to do it. So enhance the experience, and we learned a lot from this first go around. We learned how difficult it was to get people together. We learned what types of experiences would work better going together. For example, you know maybe the newcomer or Muslim group was more on the recreational side of things. Trying to combine it with an ultra competitive group maybe is not um, the most ideal experience at first. I think one day we could definitely do it, but I think you know matching the competitive levels would be one. Same with age levels. Some groups are multi-age groups, on one side, and the other side is a little bit more restricted age group. So things like that, and then in getting different sport experiences, yeah, kind of take learn from our previous experiences and taking it up a level.
From CMWI's perspective, what do you think, Eve?
So Particularly speaking out from the perspective of our family research center, I think what we are seeing is that women are in our community, Muslim women in our community, are thirsty for physical activity. They want opportunities. They want opportunities with fellow women, Muslim or non-Muslim, but women only spaces. They want to try different sports and things that they perhaps they've never had the opportunity for whatever reasons. I remember as part of the research, I will never forget a group of Afghan women who learned how to curl, like curling, and they were so excited, and they were like mature women, women with families and jobs and volunteering opportunities in the community, and yet they cultivated time to come together with non-Muslim curling instructors and volunteers to practice curling in the heart of Winnipeg. So I think is I think our community needs the spaces, needs these opportunities. So what is most important is linking capital. How can we synthesize our existing resources in order to provide the women with these opportunities?
And if I could add too on women only spaces and girl only spaces, I think sometimes there's resistance, but if you saw how different it becomes, the
The
joy,
joy.
like the increased level of participation, it's night and day. We did a little experiment with our group and we split boys and girls instead of by ages, and it was night and day. So if people could see that, then I think there'd be more support for women only spaces.
And we see that with gyms in Canada, in North America, that are offering, sections with only women's working out spaces, whether that is because, it can be tricky to find space in the weights area when you're sharing it with other men. So really, these spaces are not necessarily because of that excessive inclinations of modesty or religious entanglements. It's really just out of comfort. A lot of us, just feel more comfortable working out with fellow women.
It's one of those things, like, it's all about those, Richard, you're talking about it, about, people who are about it, more about that community, more about the enjoyment, whereas, there's people who are
Yeah.
super competitive. I remember in school, in gym class, you have the competitive people, and it changes the dynamics of things. So having spaces that are geared towards individuals' inclinations, in terms of, like, maybe a place is a little bit calmer, a little bit more quieter. Because I know going to the gym, sometimes you
Yeah,
just hear like,
yeah,
"Rah, rah, rah, rah," and sometimes you don't want that
absolutely.
energy.
So it's definitely an environment that so many of us access beyond religious reasons.